2 weeks after the Saudi-led coalition imposed a total blockade on Yemen, it says it's opening access in some areas. But is that enough for a country struggling with years of violence and a humanitarian crisis? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. Yemenis have been through a lot over the past few years. There's a devastating cholera outbreak, there's fighting and airstrikes almost every day, and now a nearly 2-week-old blockade imposed by the Saudi-led coalition fighting Iranian-backed Houthi rebels. It was put in place after the Houthis launched a missile targeting the Saudi capital, Riyadh. Saudi Arabia says it is reopening some of Yemen's ports and airports, but humanitarian aid agencies say none of their supplies are coming in. They are calling for the restrictions to be completely lifted. The UN warns Yemen could suffer the worst famine in decades if aid supplies don't resume. We'll get to our guests in a moment, but first, this report from Natasha Honeim.
You can hear the wind blowing and the chirping of birds at this port in Hodeidah. But what you don't hear much of is this. Signs that shipments of critical supplies such as food and medicine are arriving in Yemen. Saudi Arabia sealed off all ports of entry almost 2 weeks ago.
The port lost more than 70% of its operations. Poverty and starvation are now the headlines. The Saudi-led coalition has falsely claimed they have opened the port to aid vessels.
Saudi Arabia says the blockade is intended to cut off smugglers arming Houthi rebels. They've given assurances that they'll allow humanitarian aid to continue to flow. Yemenis say it's obvious shipments aren't arriving.
About 12 to 13,000 truckers are now out of work. We know that the closure is meant by the coalition to bring the Yemeni people to their knees, but the Yemeni people will never kneel, but to God.
The UN is calling for a lifting of the blockade and warns Yemen could suffer the worst famine in decades. That would add to already widespread suffering. 2.5 years of war has only exacerbated poverty in what was already the poorest country in the Middle East.
We are facing real exhausting life conditions. None of the government authorities or relief organizations are reaching out to us. Diseases are spreading and the children are getting sick. We can't afford to eat. How can we afford to treat them or buy medicine?
It's a crisis aid agencies say they're desperate to address, but can't. Natasha Honeim, Al Jazeera.
The UN says Yemen is now in the grip of the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Around 17 million people don't have enough to eat. 7 million of them are on the brink of famine. More than 2.5 years of war has forced almost 3 million people from their homes. And a cholera outbreak has killed more than 2,000 Yemenis since April. And at least 1 million children are at risk of a diphtheria outbreak. Let's bring in our panel. In Sana'a, Hakim al-Masmari, editor-in-chief of the Yemen Post. In Beirut, Adam Barron, visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. And joining us on Skype from Sana'a, Rasha Mohrez, the Director of Operations for Save the Children in Yemen. Welcome to you all. Hakim, I want to start with you. The last time I was in Yemen, which was in 2012, even then, aid agencies were warning about the spiking rates of child malnutrition. Even then, they were sounding the alarm bells. Now, UNICEF is saying that there are approximately 400,000 children at risk of death from severe acute malnutrition. Can you give our viewers a snapshot of what it's like there on the ground in Sana'a and the rest of Yemen?
In short, Mohammed, you will not recognize Yemen from the last time you came here. That's about 5 years ago. Very tragic, the lives of millions being affected on a daily basis. This was already the worst humanitarian disaster in 70 years 6 months ago. So today, I'm fearing we go back to World War I and beyond that. So it's unbearable when you see the families and so many people, so many children, so many innocent civilians dying from the basic needs of food, from hunger. Yesterday in Taiz, 2 civilians died from hunger and were found dead on the streets. And they were too honorable to beg for food. So they basically died out of hunger. And this is happening every day. As of now, until now, according to what Save the Children announced today, 130 children have die every day in Yemen. If you put that over the 1,000 days of war in Yemen, that's over 130,000 innocent children who have died in Yemen only because of war or hunger, etc. So it's tragic, Mohammed. It's unbelievable what you see. I'm surprised after living most of my life in the U.S. to see this and see the world quiet. The voice of freedom, the voice of human rights, and these innocent civilians who are paying the price, whereas the people or the sides who are fighting the war in Yemen are not being affected. They have their own funds. They control the central banks. They have international funds. It's the people, the innocent people who are vulnerable and who are paying the price, sadly.
Russia, let me pick up on something Hakim said. He cited a report that was released, I believe, yesterday from Save the Children. And I believe the number that is cited is that at least 50,000 more children, according to Save the Children, may be in danger of dying before the end of this year because of all the concurrent crises right now in Yemen. Could you elaborate on that? How dire is the situation on the ground in Yemen right now?
Well, I mean, it's very dire. As Hakim said correctly, the situation is very difficult here. We're talking about over almost 500,000 children suffering from severe malnutrition, and if they don't get right treatment, 50,000 children could die by the end of 2017, and we're expecting this number to increase even further if we don't manage to get the treatment to these children, and if the current blockade is not lifted as soon as possible, if not an immediate action is taken. We're talking about almost 7 million people are relying on purely food assistance from the UN or other humanitarian organizations. And if the humanitarian community is not able to bring in aid, those 7 million people will suffer like famine. We will see the largest famine, the largest disaster in the world in the modern human history if this is not sorted or solved very soon. If the conflict, if the violence is not ended very soon, we will see larger number of people suffering. We will see more death. Unfortunately, children will starve to death, and it would be very difficult to contain this crisis. Today, we're talking about 2 million children. They suffering, or there is an outbreak of diphtheria, and 2 million children could die of this outbreak if not to receive the right treatment. UNICEF is unable, WHO is unable to bring in those vaccines to the country and the right treatment to these children.
So in addition to cholera, in addition to malnutrition, now there's also a diphtheria outbreak to worry about?
Yes, exactly. So the diphtheria outbreak is expected in every governorate, and if it's not contained, if it's not treated, there could be even larger numbers, and also could spread to other governorates as well. We're talking about, I mean, the cholera is over 900,000 people affected by the cholera. Over 50% were children who already had malnutrition. They were more vulnerable to this outbreak. They could not, their weak bodies, they could not take the heavy antibiotics. They could not take the treatment of the cholera. We're talking about more than 16 million people in need for drinking water. And today, with this blockade over 10 days now, we're unable, there is no fuel in the market, there is shortage in fuel. Even if we want to do water trucking, if we want to deliver this water to these people in need, we cannot do it. So if this continues, and it will become very difficult to prevent further escalation of the cholera outbreak, the further spread of the cholera outbreak, or outbreak of the diphtheria, of other diseases, and like, it's not only about treatment, it's not only about bringing bringing in medical supplies to treat people, but we're also working on the prevention part of it. And if we are unable to bring in aid workers to the country, as we're today, this is the 11th day of the blockade, and Sana'a airport is closed. So even humanitarian workers are unable to travel in or out the country. So expertise not able to come in, supplies are not there. We're unable to reach the people in need. We're unable to treat children. And so we're expecting the situation to even worsen in the coming few weeks if not immediate action is taken.
That's very worrying indeed. Adam, listening to Rasha there, do you believe that the UN is doing enough to pressure Saudi Arabia to end this blockade? Could they be doing more? And do you believe that this blockade constitutes as a war crime?
I mean, I'm not an international lawyer, so with regards to whether it's a war crime, I defer to other people. Either way, when it comes to the UN, I think international actors, it would seem pretty clear that you have a number of key international actors effectively sitting back. With regards to the role of the UN, since the collapse of the Kuwait talks, the entire peace process has been effectively completely moribund. And that's when we're speaking of the UN envoy. When we're speaking of, for example, nations like the United States, you've seen a pattern where it appears that President Trump has more or less outsourced the vast majority of foreign policy in the region to the kingdom. So you've seen very little even acknowledgement of what's going on in Yemen. The abandonment even of the very modest pressure that was being put on the proponents of the Saudi-led coalition during the Obama administration effectively dissipated the second Mr. Trump took office. So no, I think in a lot of ways you're having a pattern that I've observed for many years before this conflict even took place, or before this conflict really precipitated. The world is sitting by and looking away from Yemen. And that may be easy to do, but there comes a time, I think 5 years, 10 years, 15 years down the line, where people will be asking how they let this situation just get the way it is. And I think it is quite alarming that a humanitarian disaster of this scale, the effective disintegration of a country, the collapse of government institutions that we're witnessing has just continued to take place with maybe not silence, but a great degree of international quiet.
I mean, Adam, having lived and worked in Yemen for as long as you did, are you at all shocked by how bad things have gotten?
I mean, it's remarkably alarming. Although, I mean, there are areas, obviously it's much worse in certain areas than in others. I was just in Ma'rib in central Yemen last week, which was, one of the most stable areas of the country. But it's notable that even in Ma'rib, an area that's under the internationally recognized government control, that's largely returned to a sense of normal, that's even an economic hub, you still can't walk, drive, a few minutes without noting, the effects of the war. You still have an area where there are hundreds of thousands, if not more, of IDPs, an area where poverty is still quite significant. So I think really you're looking at a situation in Yemen right now where it's truly shocking. So I think in a lot of ways the country has been set back, a decade, if not more, when it comes to development, when it comes to poverty indications, things like that. And this isn't something that's just going to stop when the war ends. Let's even look at this on a micro level. When you're dealing with a malnourished child, you're talking stunted growth. You're talking issues with regards to mental capacity. And these are things that are going to affect Yemen because it's happening on such a large scale, of not just for years, but rather generations to come.
All right, let's take a closer look at the political situation in Yemen now. As we mentioned earlier, the Houthis, who have taken control of large parts of the country, including the capital, Sana'a, are backed by Iran. They were supported by Yemen's former president, Ali Abdullah Saleh, but there are reports of a rift now. The Saudi-led coalition, which launched an aerial and ground campaign 2 years ago, is supporting President Abdurrabbu Mansour Hadi. But there seems to be a shift in the coalition's aims, with reports that President Hadi, who is currently based in Riyadh, is being restricted from visiting his country. And leaked emails appear to show Saudi Arabia's intention to pull out of Yemen, while its partner, the UAE, has become more involved. But no side appears any closer to a military victory. Okay, now, Hakim, I want to ask you, with the current rift between the Houthis and former President Saleh, And with the reported divisions within the Saudi-led coalition, how much more difficult does it now become to try and forge any kind of political solution going forward?
The rift is known, and especially since the Houthis have very low experience in politics, comparing to the GPC, the ex-president's party, who have been in rule for over 30 years. So the ex-president's party is trying to make it, to open more doors of political talks, while the Houthis are insisting on keeping political talks aside, while giving the bigger focus to the military activities and actions around the country. Now, the problem is that this friction within affects the alliance, but it does not affect the political peace talks. As of now, the blame is on the UN. Over the last 10 months alone, very little activity, very little movement by the UN, by its envoy in moving this political wheel forward. It's been a complete stalemate. I'm surprised why it's reached this situation where the UN is basically not being involved anymore after the last peace talks were last December. Until now, rarely has the envoy visited Yemen. UN officials have come to Yemen, but the problem is, as what my colleague Russia mentioned earlier, that Sana'a airport has been closed for around 11 days. That's a different case. It's been closed 11 days for UN flights. But if you look at it, no commercial flight has entered Sana'a over 450 days. So that's a complete blockade. No commercial flights. Over 15,000 civilians who wanted to get treatment abroad for medical reasons have died because they could not travel. So the blockade is even beyond or before this 11, 12 days period, and it's ongoing. The problem is the UN and international community is only pushing for UN aid to enter the country rather than ending this long 15 months siege on Yemen that has killed so many innocent civilians who are trying to get treatment or who just want to get help or even allow money to come from abroad due to the banking systems having issues. So there is political tension, and that's one of the reasons why President Hadi has not been allowed to go back to Aden, because of tension with the UAE forces. But again, these tensions that are happening between both allies is because there has been no UN activities. If the UN gets involved more in the peace talks, you would see this friction or this internal divisions at least decrease to a very large extent.
Mm-hmm. Russia, I was particularly affected several years ago on a reporting trip into Yemen. I was speaking to a doctor, and she told me that she was ashamed by the fact that she believed that her patients, so many of them weren't surviving, whereas if they were in another country with these very easily treatable maladies or diseases, that they could be treated, and that was something she thought was only going to get worse. What more can the international community do to help the situation in Yemen? Are they doing enough?
Well, I mean, as a humanitarian, I could only say that the international community need to find a solution to this conflict. They need to find an end to this conflict. There must be a way to end it peacefully. The only way to elevate the suffering, we're merely treating the symptoms of this conflict now. We're trying to put we're treating people, we're treating children, we're bringing in food, but this is not enough. We also advocate. I mean, it's not exactly true as Hakim mentioned about that we're only talking about the last 11 days blockade and to open Sana'a airport for UN flights, but we also have been advocating to reopen all ports in Yemen for commercial and for commercial flights to resume again, to allow civilians to, if they need to leave the country for treatment or for any other reason, this is their right to move freely, and this is something we've been advocating for. And since the blockade started 11 days ago, we've also been advocating to reopen Hodeidah port as well, not only to let in humanitarian cargo, but also to let in commercial vessels to be allowed to dock and to offload their cargo. I mean, today we're talking about 29 vessels. They weren't allowed. They weren't given clearance, and they were asked to leave the inner anchorage in Hodeidah port. And they're carrying over almost 500,000 metric ton of fuel, of food. And this is not just humanitarian supplies. This is supplies that should support the market. They should make the market basically able to respond to these needs of people, and also to make sure its dynamic is there to allow us to do our work as well. So, I mean, again, as I started by saying, the international community needs to sit and find a solution to end this violence and end this conflict. And it's not we're calling, even funding is not enough for Yemen. We're talking about the Yemen response plan is only to respond to the increasing humanitarian needs. As I believe now, I remember it's almost only 30% funded. So there are so many efforts so far, but they're not enough. There is a need for more efforts to bring in a solution to this conflict in Yemen.
Adam, you've written in the past that, while the U.S. and Saudi Arabia remain an integral part of trying to forge a solution in Yemen and other regional actors as well, that also there has to be a plan that involves local actors, even on the tribal level. Can you walk me through what exactly that means? And at this stage, with things being as bad as they are in Yemen, is that something that could even be possible?
Well, I mean, I'd frame it in practical terms. At this point, the central government in Yemen has effectively collapsed. And I'd even go as far to say dissipated in many parts of the country. This means that in many areas, whether you're looking at the south, whether you're looking at the province of Marib, even certain areas under the control of the Houthis in Salah, you're looking at a situation where really lower level, more locally focused actors are in the ground. So what this means is when you're putting Yemen together, when you're putting Yemen back again, you're going to have to incorporate the opinions of, the tribesmen, the tribal forces in Yemen that are effectively the main force in the ground. You're going to have to incorporate the voices of people in the eastern provinces of Hadramaut and Mahra. You're going to have to do so in the south with the secessionists to an even greater way. You're going to have to do so in Taiz. And in a lot of ways, the fact that Yemen has always been ruled primarily out of Sana'a has been something that's really caused a lot of the friction, a lot of the conflict that we've seen over the past decade and a half. So I think a key thing moving forward is really, one, acknowledging the dramatic shifts that have taken place on the ground with regards to how Yemen is governed, and two, creating a more decentralized, equitable framework and a new social contract for the country.
Hakim, Adam's saying there is essentially no functioning government in Yemen. Now, because of that, the economy there is essentially a war economy. Are government workers being paid at all? Are people receiving their salaries? If not, how much worse does it make the crisis?
It's unbelievable, Mohammed. As Adam mentioned earlier, ending the war will not end the crisis. Right now, each province or region is acting as if it's an independent country, ignoring the other parts of the country that are suffering. Right now, as of now, those who are under Houthi-controlled areas, they have not received salaries for over 12 months. So imagine life with no food, no money. Even if you had food in the country, people cannot buy the food. You have so much people who are now volunteering to help the poor, so much international efforts that are happening, but they are also limited. But it's unbearable to see families who have no salaries, no food, who are living this crisis every day, and not to forget the bombardment that they have to undergo on a daily basis for the last nearly 1,000 days. So it's very tragic, and it's not only, both sides are ignoring the people. The Houthis and the Salah alliance are ignoring the rights of the people. Saudi-led or supported government are also ignoring the rights of the people, because they, people under their control, have also not received salaries for months and months and months. So the governments, both sides, are not doing enough for the people. They're not working for the people, and that's why the focus for the Yemeni people is looking for the international community to help, because they have been degraded by its own rulers, whoever they are, whether they're supported by Saudi or the Houthi alliance. So it's tragic. I remember the many times you were in Yemen over the last couple of years, back to 2009, and after that, we visited Sab'in Hospital for a couple of hours. If you visit it today, you will not believe what you see. When you see children dying right in front of you, when you visit for 1 hour or 2 hours, you will see at least 2 children die in front of your eyes. That was not the case before. Then there was hunger, malnutrition. Today is the case where they cannot even suffer from malnutrition anymore. It's the phase of dying from hunger now.
It's a very complicated situation that seems to only be growing more complicated. We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you to all our guests, Hakim al-Masmari, Adam Barron, and Rasha Mohrez. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.